Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's author series virtual event. My name is Irene Moan, and I will be your host for this evening's program. Before we begin, I'd like to let the viewers know that this event will be recorded and posted on the Save Ellis Island YouTube channel. Tonight's program is brought to you by Save Ellis Island. Save Ellis Island is a nonprofit partner of the National Park Service for the restoration and reuse of the historic hospital buildings on Ellis Island's south side. To learn more about us and the work being done to preserve this national icon, you can visit us at www.saveellisisland.org. Again, my name is Irene Moan, and I'm the Education Associate at Save Ellis Island. I work with the Director of Museum Education to develop and implement education programs about the immigrant hospital complex that operated on the south side of Ellis Island from 1902 to 1951. For tonight's author series, we are joined by author Carole Limata to discuss her latest book, Celestina's Story, part of which is set in the immigrant hospital on the south side of Ellis Island. There will be time for you to ask Carole questions towards the end of our program tonight, so if you have any questions throughout the program, please type them in the chat box, and they will be addressed later on during the Q&A portion. Carole Limata is the author of Luna Babies and the Ellis Angels series, which includes Ellis Angels, the Nurses of Ellis Island Hospital, Ellis Angels on the Move, and Angels in Brooklyn, and her most recent novel, Celestina's Story. Ellis Angels is the first in the series. After graduating from Queens College, Carole received a bachelor's degree from Sacramento State University and a master's degree in nursing from the University of California at San Francisco. Throughout her 40-year nursing career, Carole worked as a staff nurse, genetic supervisor, maternity instructor, and director. After retirement from nursing, she began writing historical fiction novels. In 2017, Carole received an Excellence in Nursing Research Award from the International Nurses Honor Society in recognition of her nursing history research for Ellis Angels. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Carole. I'm really excited to discuss your book.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so to begin, Carole is going to give a short presentation about the story, the setting, and some of the background history and research that went into creating this novel. So Carole, if you want to start, I can also move the slides for you whenever you need. Okay.
Great. Next slide. Thank you all for coming and zooming in tonight. This is the cover of Celestina's Story. We saw that in the beginning of the program. Next slide. So my slideshow will just give a brief summary of the story, and then I want to show you pictures of the hospitals, buildings, and the museum building on Ellis Island. I'm going to discuss the changes that happened to Ellis Island during the Depression years and during World War II. And then I want to give a shout out to the National Park Service Oral History Project. Ready for the next slide? The story begins in 1992. The Grand Ellis Island Registry has been transformed into the museum that stands today. The museum opened in 1990. Next slide. So Celestina is our main character. She worked as a registered nurse at Ellis Island Hospital from 1927 to 1946. She's retired now and 90 years old when she receives an invitation to participate in the National Parks Service Oral History Project. When she accepts and is interviewed, she recalls her years living and working on Ellis Island and the changes to both the hospital and the island during the Depression years and during World War II. Next slide. When Celestina first came to the island in 1927, this is what the island looked like. It was divided into 3 distinct peninsulas, and the peninsulas were called Island 1, Island 2, and Island 3. Island 1 hosts the registry building, which is now the museum. Island 2 was the general hospital, and I'll show you a picture of the facade of the General Hospital next. And then Island 3 is actually the community, the contagious disease hospital that's made up of several buildings to isolate the different diseases. And on Island 2, in the corner, in the right corner, was a building which was the nurses' residence. That's where the nurses lived when they worked in the General Hospital. The General Hospital, together with the Contagious Disease Hospital, formed a 750-bed hospital, which is a huge complex, and it was the second largest hospital in New York City, second only to Bellevue City Hospital. Next slide. So this is what the General Hospital looks like today. And I took that picture, and I was standing in front of the ferry building, and I was taking the picture across the water. Next slide. This is a diagram I found on the third floor of the museum, which nicely shows the 3 different islands of Ellis Island. And you can see the nurses' residence cottage at the bottom of Island 2. And the other thing I wanted to point out to you was on Island 3, there are some curved corridors. And this was also designed to curtail contagion. The next slide. So before I explain this slide, I want to tell you a little bit about the Depression. So we all know the Depression started with the stock market collapse in November 1929. By 1931, we were in the height of the Depression. Unemployment skyrocketed. Immigration was at an all-time low. And consequently, the hospital census was severely affected. It was decided that they would temporarily close the entire hospital at the end of 1931. So the nurses were laid off. And in this particular book, the nurse Celestina went to work as a community health nurse at a settlement house. And when everything reopened in 1934, she came back to her old job. But the island was different. Now we see that islands 2 and 3 are connected, and there's no longer a waterway in between them. The nurses' cottage has been torn down. It was more cost-effective to tear it down in the middle of the Depression than to fix up all of the decay. And when the nurse came back, the main hospital and the nurses' dormitory, all the action was on Island 3. And actually, the General Hospital was deserted at that time. The next slide. So this is what the aerial view of Ellis Island looks like today. And I explained all the different buildings. Next slide. In the late 1930s, the Coast Guard started to think about establishing a training station on Ellis Island because there was room in the General Hospital and in the Registry Building. In the next few years, the Coast Guard station would serve over 60,000 men. Now, in 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and France and England declared war on Germany. While President Roosevelt was declaring America's neutrality to the world, the Pentagon got busy securing our shorelines and borders in the United States. Next slide. Ellis Island was a strategic location to secure land borders and shorelines in the Northeast. It also served as a training base where seamen learned to maneuver small vessels through strong currents, heavy surf, sandbars, and reefs. Because of that training, later, they would be asked to pilot and co-pilot the thousands of landing vessels and Higgins boats that landed on the Normandy beaches on D-Day. Next slide. Here's a diagram I wanted to show you of New York City. So Ellis Island is at the tip of Manhattan, and the Coast Guard scouts would go south through the Narrows, which separated Staten Island and Brooklyn, and could go right into the Atlantic Ocean. Another scout could go up and down on the west side. They would go up and down the Hudson River. On the east side is the East River that channels out into Long Island Sound, which separates Connecticut from Long Island. All of these waterways had the potential for Germans to enter the country illegally. And actually, they discovered twice German spies coming into the country during the early 1940s. Next slide. In the spring of 1944, President Roosevelt ordered the Coast Guard to provide search and rescue craft for the D-Day invasion. And here's just one picture of two cutters off the coast of France. Next slide. The Coast Guard deployed 60 of their 83 wooden-hulled cutters to England for service during D-Day. Their hull numbers were removed, and they were given new designations of 1 to 60, preceded by USCG, United States Coast Guard. Next slide. Now, the smaller ships could not travel across the Atlantic Ocean, so each cutter was transported piggyback style on freighters to Poole, England. The flotilla was nicknamed the Matchbox Fleet because of their wooden hulls and two gasoline engines. A shell that would hit a cutter can easily turn it into a fireball. Next slide. On D-Day, these cutters and their crews carried out the Coast Guard's task of saving lives under enemy fire. The Coast Guard cutters saved more than 400 men on June 6th. When the unit was decommissioned in December 1944, they had saved almost 1,500 lives. Next slide. These are just some pictures I found. So this is one of the Coast Guard USCG-6, and they took those pictures. The next slide has USCG-16, and they actually took a tally of the 116 lives that they saved on D-Day. The next slide. Now, there's a little vignette in the book where the nurse talks when she went back to Ellis Island in the 1930s and 40s, that the restrictions on nurses were softened. So in 1927, when she first started, she actually had to have a ferry pass signed by her supervisor to leave the island. And they were not allowed to leave the island unless it was their day off. But as 1930s and 40s came about, they could leave the island. And during World War II, the island became so busy with the Coast Guard and taking care of wounded soldiers that the nurses were actually moved off the island. And during the last 2 years of the war, the nurses lived in hotels in the city. In this little vignette, the nurses were invited to go to Glen Island Casino to listen to the Glenn Miller band that was playing. The next slide. So there's just a little picture. They were playing in the summer of 1939, and then again they came back in 1942. Next slide. So going back to the story, so Celestina gives the oral history interview, but then she starts to think of all the patients that she cared for at Ellis Island Hospital. So memories of her work caring for them come flooding to the surface. As she begins telling us her patients' stories, she wonders how her patients fared in America. Later in the novel, some of her questions are answered after her daughter does a database search of the 2,000 oral histories that are housed at the Ellis Island Museum Library. So here's my shout out to the National Park Service Oral History Program. The program is not limited to the stories of immigrants. The immigrant stories actually started in 1970. So volunteers have been collecting these oral histories for 50 years. There have been thousands of oral histories conducted by both park rangers and volunteers at the 400 units that the National Park Service oversees. These 400 units include monuments, battlefields, memorials, and 63 national parks. From Ellis Island in New York to the Rosie the Riveter Monument in Richmond, California, to Hawaii, you would be able to access these oral histories. For the Ellis Island oral histories, they are available on the web. Of course, not all of them, but you can hear and read some of the oral histories that have been placed on the web. And I think that's the end of the slideshow.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Carol. And can you just explain a little bit about the images at the last slide? Are these the covers of your previous book?
These are the covers of the book. I wrote Celestina's story as a standalone book. But actually, it really could be part of the series. The series starts in 1924. Ellis Island is mentioned in the first book and the second book. And then the nurses go to Brooklyn and they're establishing a settlement house, working with the immigrants. And there were almost, I think if I remember correctly, there were almost 300 settlement houses across the country. And the purpose of the settlement house was actually to help the immigrants adapt to the culture in America.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing the presentation here so I can start asking you a few questions. Let me just make sure we...
I think we were going to do a reading next.
Yes. I believe you choose two readings from the World War II period in the book related to the Coast Guard and their involvement with Operation D-Day.
Yes.
And then some of Celestina's personal
Yes.
experience with that. If you'd like to read those passages now, that'd be great. Thank you.
You notice I put my glasses on for that. Okay, the first one is chapter 26, and it's called Top Secret. And it's in the words of Celestina. She is writing this down. Changes were in the air as 1944 approached. Secrets were stirring all across the island. People began to talk in whispers. The Coast Guard cutter assigned to Ellis Island sailed away one day and never returned. Smaller vessels gradually disappeared. 10% of the troops and only a handful of patrol boats and lifeboats for shore patrol duty remained at the Ellis Island Coast Guard Station. "Where are they all going?" we asked. "Just traveling up the Hudson River," they answered. We knew larger ocean-going ships were docked at the city's west side. "What's happening?" we asked. "Top secret," they replied. Fanny and I were putting the pieces of the puzzle together and coming up with nothing. We heard that massive numbers of Coast Guard sailors had been ordered overseas. What military plan could possibly require large numbers of Coast Guard seamen to be assigned to Europe? We knew that the Coast Guard were often called upon to search the seas for German submarines and U-boats. They offered protection to warships and aircraft carriers when they crossed the dangerous waters of the Atlantic. But this seemed different. We remained in the dark until the morning of June 7, 1944, when news of the largest amphibious military invasion in the history of the United States was broadcast across the nation. On D-Day, June 6th, the combined forces of the American, Britain, and Canadian military landed on the beaches of Normandy, France. Close to 7,000 ships and 4,000 landing vessels were needed to transport the troops, the tanks, ammunition, and supplies across the English Channel. Our Coast Guard had been called upon to pilot the landing vessels. When the sailors from the Navy piloted, the Coast Guard helped them to co-pilot. Within hours of the invasion, a flotilla of Coast Guard search and rescue boats combed the seas for surviving soldiers, sailors, paratroopers, and downed airplane pilots. They were credited for saving over 400 lives that day. And I have another little reading. It doesn't take too long. This is chapter 24, and it's called Sentimental Journey. It's actually the words of Celestina's daughter, Helena, who takes care of her mother. So she writes, "One July evening, I walked over to Mama's cottage simply to say goodnight to her. I found her peacefully sipping chamomile tea and listening to her record player. Yes, she had a record player because when she moved into our little cottage, she wouldn't part with it. It was an awkward radio record player television combination that was mass-produced in the 1950s. The television screen was 8 inches, but the small size didn't matter because the television hadn't worked in years. Mama was playing one of her favorite 78 singles, Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. I sat down next to her and listened to the remaining minute of the song. Mother had saved a dozen of these heavy shellac 78 pre-war records. When I was a teenager, avidly collecting my own collection of vinyl 45s, Mother wistfully mentioned that she had contributed most of her record collection to the war effort. She donated her chipped, scratched, and cracked records. At the time, I couldn't comprehend how a bunch of used records could possibly help anyone win a war. Did you send them off to entertain the troops? I asked. No, sweetheart. The records were made of shellac, and shellac was used to make ammunitions. One of President Roosevelt's first war decree was to halt the production of shellac records. Making records required too much of America's limited supply of shellac. Soon after, record makers switched to vinyl long-playing LP albums and the smaller 45s. That sounds weird, I said. Doesn't it? What was really weird was that they held morale-boosting recruitment rallies to draft our old records into what they called the National Photograph Record Corps. You're kidding. I'm not. I remember going to a dance when the admission price was 5 used shellac records. We gave everything we had to the war effort. But I see you saved some for yourself, didn't you? Well, only broken records were drafted. I saved the good ones. How could I give them up? The music was the only tangible thing I had of the memory of the night your dad and I danced before the war. You can't imagine how lovely it was dancing to the music of Glenn Miller's orchestra. They were performing in New Rochelle during the summer of 1939. They played again at the Glen Island Casino for a limited engagement. Glenn Miller's orchestra was playing in 1942, the night your father asked me to dance for the first time. So that's it for the excerpts from the novel.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Carol. I think the novel does such a nice job of weaving those immensely impactful historical events with like the personal details of the characters' lives. And it really creates a really wonderful read, and the characters are very relatable.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah. I'm going to ask you a few questions now. So Celestina was a nurse, and many of the characters in your previous nurse novels were nurses as well. And I'm wondering how your own experiences in your career in nursing have influenced your writing, and if
Oh,
there's
of
any,
course.
yeah, and if there's any specific experiences you had in your nursing career that maybe inspired themes in this novel or events in this novel.
Um, Actually, it's in every novel because the first time I went to Ellis Island, I didn't even notice the general hospital. The second time I went, I had brought visitors from California, and I was in awe of this immense hospital that I had never heard of before. And I worked in New York in the city hospitals. Um, After that visit, I wanted to find out more about the General Hospital, but there wasn't too much written about it. The only thing I found was Laurie Conway's video and her book, Forgotten Ellis Island. Um, and then I found myself imagining different scenarios based on my own nursing experience. And then looking back after 40 years of nursing, one of the things Celestina does is she remembers her old patients. And what she says in the book is that she sometimes remembers a name, sometimes she remembers a diagnosis, and sometimes she remembers a face. But it's very rare that she remembers all three at the same time. And that was my experience, is that I remember taking care of a young man who had a liver transplant. And he was only 17, and I think I was only 21. And I sometimes think, I wonder how he's doing. And then I was working in the premature nursery center at Elmhurst Hospital. We took care of premature babies. It was 1968, so we had them for a long time, sometimes 3 or 4 months. And I got very attached to them. And I sometimes think, oh, this is 50 years later. I wonder what happened to those babies and if they had a good life. So I have that in the book. That's a memory that Celestina has.
Great. And you mentioned that basically a lot of these novels were inspired by your visit to the island and realizing that this hospital existed there. Your novels, as someone who works there, I feel like your novels do a really great job of bringing that history to life. And I was really impressed with the detail and depth of information you had about the hospitals in the novel. So I was wondering, besides you mentioned Laurie Conway's book and video, Forgotten Ellis Island, were there any other, what were the other resources you were using to really paint this picture of what it was like to be there?
Definitely the Hard Hat Tour. So I have to shout out for if anyone hasn't gone on that Hard Hat Tour. It's a fantastic tour. I went with my husband and my son, and I actually gave a presentation before that. But that really, by taking the tour, you get to see the structure of the hospitals. And I had the opportunity when I went to Queens College for my nursing degree. Queens College is not affiliated with any one hospital. So we traveled around to all the city hospitals, and many of them were built around the same time. So I didn't even have to imagine the Ellis Island wards because I had worked on those same wards, like, for instance, at Greenpoint Hospital in Williamsburg. The other thing, the National Parks Oral History, I went on the web and I started to listen to oral histories. And the librarians did a search for me. There was not one oral history by a nurse, but there were many by patients. So I read many of the patient stories. And I was going to say something else about the New York City hospitals, and then I forgot it. Sorry.
That's okay. I actually wanted to ask you, so you just happened to find the National Parks Service Oral History Project by doing like a internet search? Like, was that how you?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So you can go on the National Park Service, and under Ellis Island, you can access some of the oral histories. In 2013, when I did my first research, all of the histories were kind of all clumped together, but now they've done a fantastic job of isolating the different countries. And for instance, I just clicked on World War II histories, or if you have an idea of, for instance, like people coming from Poland, you could click on Poland. So they have it really well organized, but you're not going to be able to access all of them. Also, some are in dialogue form, some are recorded, and some you actually have to read.
And so you used a lot of them within the novel. Like, how did you go about kind of gathering inspiration from the oral histories and kind of infusing that in the novel? Because in the novel, she is also reading some oral histories, but these are obviously fictional. But
Those are all
yeah,
fictional. Those are
okay.
all fictional. So this is what I did. I read the oral histories to get an idea of where people were coming from. And then I read the oral histories to get an idea of what kind of diseases or conditions would allow a patient to be admitted to the hospital. And I'll give you an example. There is an oral history by a woman named Nettie Ratner. And she says that she was detained at the hospital for a couple of weeks because she had a hearing loss. So I just like that idea of a hearing loss. And I created a fictional family that came to Ellis Island that genetically they all either could not hear or had a hearing loss. And the father told the family that he would do all the talking. But even though the father was deaf, he had learned how to lip read. So that family actually fooled the inspectors, and the inspectors never, they admitted the family because they didn't realize that the family had a hearing loss. So I changed the stories around.
Right. Um, so after your long career in nursing, what inspired you to pursue writing when you retired?
Well, I was always interested in writing, but I never had the time or the stories, or probably even the confidence. I did take a couple of classes, but I have to tell you truthfully, I was very intimidated by the talent of my fellow classmates. So it wasn't until I was older that I had more confidence and said I could do this. I think that nursing helps in writing because as a nurse, you're constantly documenting. So everything you do in the course of a day with a patient, you're actually journaling and charting and putting that documentation into a chart. And I always enjoyed that part of nursing at the end of the day.
That's really interesting that you have those transferable skills. Why did you pick historical fiction for your writing?
I love historical fiction. About 30 years ago, I read a novel by Alan Bernhardt called Molokai. And it's about the leper colony in Molokai, Hawaii. And I remember that was the first novel that I ever read that was labeled historical fiction. And I was amazed afterwards that I wanted to find out what was fact and what was fiction. So when I read historical fiction, it really awakens my interest in history. And I've learned so much that somehow I missed when I was in high school and college.
Yeah, as a former teacher, I could say it's a great tool for getting people more interested in history while also, enjoying the fiction part, the story part. Um, well, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about one of your other novels that has a slightly different historical context than the Ellis Island novels. All of the Ellis Angels
I
revolve.
know you like that one. I
Yeah, I
know.
was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, it's called Luna Babies. What was
Yeah.
kind of the background for that novel? Because it's a little bit
Okay,
different.
I'm just going to read from the back
Oh,
cover.
okay.
Okay. Luna Babies is the story of the popular premature baby exhibit that existed for 40 years at one of Coney Island's largest amusement parks, Luna Park. From 1903 to 1943, 8,000 premature infants were cared for by Dr. Walter Bear and displayed to spectators who paid admission to view them. This is their story, spoken through the words of his family, his wife, his daughter, and his nurse. Was Dr. Bear showcasing the premature infants as freaks of nature, exploiting them for their own financial gain? Or was he providing them with the highest level of health care, which was their only hope for survival? And in the book, you find that he was very sincere in caring for the infants, um, even though it was in Luna Park, a very busy, busy place. The hospital that he kept was sterile and pristine. The visitors came in and saw the babies through glass partition. And I remember asking my mother, is this for real? I had never heard of it. I had worked in as I said, the Premature Nursery Center in 1968, 1969, and 1970. And that was a center for premature babies in the city hospitals. What I didn't know and what was so interesting to me is that we were following Dr. Bear's model. And his idea, he had come to New York to sell the incubators, but because of the high mortality rates of premature infants, the hospitals really didn't want to get involved with the incubators. So what he did is he made a pact with the different hospitals in New York that if a premature baby was born, they would notify him and he would go and meet with the parents and offer to take care of their baby free of charge. He never charged a penny for his service, but the whole exhibit was financed by people coming through the exhibit. First, it was a nickel, and then it was a dime. But you have to remember this was before television, before a lot of the technology of today. So people had never seen premature infants, so they were very, very interested in actually seeing them up close. And he had an absolutely fantastic rate of success. 95% of his infants lived.
That's amazing. Yeah. I think it's incredible that you're able to bring to light with your novels these untold stories like the Luna babies and the premature babies, but also like the Ellis Island hospital and the nurses. Like you said, when you first came to visit, you didn't know it existed. And now you were able to create this whole series to get the word out there, to let people know that this was a place and this is its story. And you do a wonderful job of, weaving the
Really
history
fun.
with this story. Yeah, it's great.
Thank you.
So I have one last question for you before we go into the question and answer portion from the viewers. Do you have any future novels or projects in the works?
Actually, I just finished a book, but it's not in publication yet. It's in the hands of my editor. Um, it's a little bit different. It's not historical fiction, it's fiction, and it's called The House on Love Lane. Um, it's well, here's my blurb on it. Magical things are happening at the building located on Love Lane. Francesca, the main character, always believed that her grandfather was the man behind the magic. But when her grandfather dies, it's up to Francesca to uncover the mystery of the House of Love Lane. And there really is a Love Lane in Brooklyn. It's a two-story, a two block little lane in Brooklyn Heights. And the story goes, this is a true story, that at the turn of the century, it was all tree covered and private, and that lovers would meet there and in secret and walk down to the East River Promenade. And that's why it was called Lover's Lane.
Wow.
I thought that was cute.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to reading that project when it comes out. Thank you for letting us know about that. I'm going to open it up to questions from the viewers. So if you guys have questions, you can type them in the chat box. We do have a comment from Diane. She said, fascinating story about the 78 records. My parents had saved a few of these. They were heavier and shinier, if I remember. We'll love to read your books now. Thank you.
I have a few too from my mother also. They're very heavy and they break very easily. That is also a true story about the core, the photograph core.
Mhm. That's so fascinating. I believe this question is from Kesha or Keisha. Why were all the isolation units for patients with measles but none for TB?
I don't really understand that
I'm
question.
not sure I understand either because we there were awards for
So there's
TB.
different wards. There's in the contagious disease hospital, there's different wards. So yes, measles was a very common disease. And they did have different little houses for measles, but they did have houses for TB,
Mhm.
except that TB was such a long recovery that usually they sent them out to, they only kept them a short time. And then they sent them out. There are a number of TB hospitals. I remember the book that I had just read, there was one in Staten Island, right? Um, and so they would be transferred.
Thank you. I'm gonna wait a minute to see if there's any other questions. She said thank you. But if not, I might just start sharing my slides then. Anyone have any other questions? It doesn't look like it. Um,
Well, I was delighted to share this with you and delighted to meet you also.
yes, thank you so much, Carol. I'm just gonna share my screen one more last time before we go. Are you able to see my screen as it is right now? Let's see. Okay, I just wanted to share this last slide. That concludes our programming for this evening. Thank you again for joining us, Carol, to speak about your wonderful novel. If any of our viewers are interested in purchasing an autographed copy of her book, you can do so on the Save Ellis Island website under the shop tab. I've also included a QR code here under her book. You can scan that and it'll bring you to the page to purchase it. All proceeds from the book go directly to supporting Save Ellis Island's mission to restore the 29 buildings in the historic hospital complex. And also, if you're interested in learning more about the immigrant hospital complex and the history of nursing on Ellis Island, Save Ellis Island is having a specialty healthcare tour taking place this Saturday, November 16th. It'll be from 11 to 12:30 p.m. It's led by one of our veteran guides, Denise Giachetta Ryan, who is a former nurse herself, as well as former CUNY professor and chair of the Department of Nursing. If you want to purchase tickets for that or tickets for a general hard hat tour, you can scan the QR code on the right-hand side, and that'll bring you to our website. Thank you again, Carol, and thank you again to all of the viewers who joined us this evening. We really appreciate your interest in our work and your support. I hope everyone enjoyed tonight's program, and I hope you have a great rest of your night. Thank you.
And thank you, Irene, for all the work that you did behind the scenes.
Thank you, Carol. All right, bye-bye.
Okay, so I'll say good night. Thank you for listening.